So this is the second part of the fact-checking presentations. In this one, I just wanted to focus on the difference between checking straight up news features and reported pieces versus columns and op-eds, because you might run into both as you're fact-checking. And I just wanted to start with this example of the CNN fact-checker basically listing a lot of the errors that he found in Trump's convention speech, just because I think it's a good example of how many things you can find in a single piece, and that should kind of show you that the whole foundation of the speech or piece is just wrong. So here we go.
Daniel, certainly there's a lot to break down from the president's more than an hour-long speech.
Anderson, this president is a serial liar, and he serially lied tonight. I counted preliminarily more than 20 false or misleading claims. I want to go through a whole bunch of them quickly because I think it's all important. Trump said Joe Biden is, quote, talking about taking down the border wall. Biden has specifically, explicitly rejected that idea. He just said he'll stop further additional construction. Trump claimed, as always, that he is the one who passed the Veterans' Choice Law. Barack Obama signed that into law in 2014. Trump signed a 2018 law to modify it. Trump said, I have done more for the African-American community than any president since Abraham Lincoln. That is ludicrous. Lyndon Johnson, for one, signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Trump again touted a, quote, record 9 million job gain over the past 3 months. He didn't mention, as usual, that that gain follows a record 22 million job loss over the previous 2 months. He said he'll, quote, continue to lower drug prices. They've increased during his presidency. He said they opened a Jerusalem embassy for less than 500,000. Early documents show it was at least 21 million. He claimed NATO member spending has increased for the first time in about 20 years. Spending, in fact, rose in 2015 and in 2016 before he took office. He said he will always, and Republicans will always, strongly protect people with pre-existing conditions. That pledge has already been broken. He and they have repeatedly tried to weaken those protections in Obamacare. He claimed, again, that he banned.
Okay, you get the idea. That goes on for many, many more minutes. Okay, so news features and reported full pieces. So these can be anything from investigations to long explanatory reporting. Vox does a lot of like these long explanatory pieces about big ideas, breaking news, and event recaps. The CNN fact checker in the previous slide is a good example of an event recap and checking people's statements and what happened. So when you fact check pieces like this, it can be pretty intensive because you're ideally also going to be talking to the writer's sources. You basically end up re-reporting much of the story. Because you want to make sure that the reporting the writer originally did, it stands up if it's questioned again. So things that you'll check are simple things like dates, names, statistics they're pulling, any studies they're quoting from, again, contacting their sources. And then also something that's really helpful in pieces like this is contacting experts or people who just have a lot of background knowledge in whatever the story's topic is. So for example, something like this could be if you're checking a big piece about COVID, just talking to an epidemiologist that the writer might not have interviewed or quoted from, but it would still help you to talk to for background knowledge. You should definitely do that if you still have questions after looking through the rest of the writer's resources. Another thing you can do in pieces like this is looking through interview transcripts or the reporting notes from the writer. I've definitely relied on transcripts more than actually calling up sources in certain instances. I wouldn't say that that's like the default thing to do, but I have relied on transcripts before for checking pieces, for example, that had to do with sexual assault and harassment at a fast food chain, because the writer And my supervisor and I all agreed that it would actually do more harm and re-traumatize the writer's sources to have a fact checker that they've never met, have not built a relationship of trust with, to call them up and basically start questioning them about these very painful and traumatic memories. So for that example is one time that I basically just read the writer's interview transcripts with the sources to double check the events of each person. And then especially with investigations, it's really, really helpful to look through any spreadsheets the writer has. Oftentimes, if the writer already is wrote this investigation, they're going to have public records that they used. So they should 100% be sending them to you also. So related to all of that is the difference between primary and secondary sources. This is something I think sometimes people learn when they learn about like libraries and just like general academic research, but it's also super, super important in fact checking because you want to lean on as many primary sources as you can get. So these are things like people and documents that are directly from the source of whatever you're talking about. So these can be things like executive orders, the actual text of a law, public records, which I have a note on in the next slide. That's why it's asterisked. And then transcripts of speeches or encounters or anything like that, where you can just like actually listen to them firsthand yourself and not rely on someone else's account for them. So relying on someone else's account or interpretation of information is considered a secondary source. So these can be some academic journals who might be analyzing a primary source for their own purposes. They can still be really helpful, but you just have to keep in mind that it is not an original source. So making sure that you're not taking in that person's interpretation to the straight facts you're trying to check. Other news stories account of an event is sometimes you have to look at these because the writer might not have actually been at the event that took place themselves. So you have to rely on other news accounts. I would just say be really careful with this. Read as many possible news accounts as you can to make sure that they all seem pretty consistent. And then if they are not consistent and you're seeing a lot of differences from one place to the next, it's definitely something to flag to the editor and writer as an inconsistency. And then again, reviews and essays about an original piece of work are considered secondary as well. So this is just a note on the primary source of public records, specifically police reports. So this should not be news at this point, but just to reiterate, fact checkers and reporters and editors should not be relying on police reports for the information they're using for their story, especially if it is some sort of investigation into police misconduct, because as we all know, or maybe know, there are so many examples of police lying or omitting information in their reports. If you do have access to them, if the writer does have them and they send them to you, you can read them and look at the details on them, but you should be reading them very skeptically and not using it as your only way to verify events or people or anything like that. So this is just an example of one instance where a police report was falsified. I'll give you a second to read that. And then these are just more examples of why we should not be relying on police reports. Okay, so with columns and op-eds, these can be things like TV pundit shows. Some examples off the top of my head are Anderson Cooper's show or Patriot Act, or John Oliver, things like that. They actually do, I know John Oliver and Patriot Act actually do hire fact checkers, which is good because they're talking about news. It can also just be in the traditional sense of columns and op-eds for print publications. Also sometimes personal essays that people write about something that might be in the news cycle can still pretty heavily rely on events or things happening in the news. So they might still have facts kind of interwoven in them that would need to be checked. So usually, since these are kind of a mix of narrative and fact, they sometimes won't have interviews that the writer did, or transcripts or something like that for you to contact. So you might have a little less to reach out to, but still, you know, there'll be plenty to check for sure. And actually, these pieces can be even trickier than reported pieces sometimes, because the whole point of them is that someone is offering you their slant of, or their interpretation of the news. So it's almost like you have to be extra careful with the facts they're presenting, because they can sometimes slip into misleading people or fallacies, like I mentioned in this slide. But yeah, so things that you'll check are same thing as reported pieces, like dates, names, statistics. It can still be helpful to contact experts, even if the writer did not talk to certain experts, but you really, really want to double or triple check an idea or a claim. And then again, yeah, something really important with these is fallacies often come up in persuasive writing like this. These are just some examples of, I think most people might have already learned fallacies, but if not, like, these are just some of the common examples. You know, these I think show up in op-eds and things like that all the time, unfortunately. But your job as a fact checker is to make sure that, like, the facts that they are presenting in their argument are not contributing to these. So yeah, these are pretty common, but you should try to avoid them when you can. This is just an example. The Washington Post has a video series, I believe, from their fact checkers. This was a good one on coronavirus testing, because I think the information about COVID testing is really, really inconsistent depending on where you are and what you might be hearing from one person to another. So I think this was a good topic for them to talk about with their fact checker. I'm only going to play a minute or two of this, but it just, I think, kind of illustrates why fact checkers need to do much more than just checking simple things like statistics and names and dates. You should really be looking at the whole big idea that a writer is presenting, and make sure that at its core, that story is not misleading or going to represent inaccurate information to someone. So.
We've been scrambling to find those labs with tests. There's an incredible shortage. We have 3 hospital systems in Camden County. We speak to those systems each day. They've just been able to get their hands on some tests within the last week, and they don't have enough tests.
Trump again tried to reassure people that the tests were coming.
Testing and testing capabilities are expanding rapidly day by day. We are moving very quickly.
It's clear that effort fell far short. The US went from 11 confirmed cases to nearly 100,000 in a matter of weeks. Still, in comparison to other countries, experts say the US is behind in its efforts to test. a fact that can at least in part be attributed to the failures in the administration's ability to cut red tape. The federal government failed to pivot, adapt, or respond at several critical points. The president spent nearly 2 months issuing confusing and contradictory signals, leaving the bureaucratic machine of the US government to chart the course for the response. The FDA picked a conservative testing strategy, and the executive branch did nothing. When the CDC test failed, neither a new strategy nor a new test were available for more than 2 weeks. By the time the government changed course, the virus was out of control. Now, it's not just the number of tests that are the problem. It's getting the materials to do the tests and the personal protective equipment for providers to give those tests. That means we may never have a true count of how many Americans contracted the virus.
So I think that was a really important part of this video, because the only reason that fact checker is able to kind of present all of those really big conclusions and claims is because they did such a deep dive about testing throughout the whole country, and you and a writer or an editor or whoever it is cannot make such wide sweeping claims or conclusions without doing a ton of work to make sure that if you're questioned on them, you can back them up. So obviously they did do a lot of work for this fact checker to be able to say all those claims definitively. So yeah, I think that is all I had for you guys. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was helpful. And I hope I can answer any questions that you all might have if they come up. Yeah, thanks so much for listening. Bye.